Oh, this must be the podcast.
Believing in a conspiracy is a dandy way to demonize whomever you don't like in American society. He was a staffer at the high school, stuck his head in the door and said, "They've shot Kennedy." And then he said, "We're trying to get some news about it, but we can't," which sounded a bit sinister.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the second episode of This Must Be the Podcast. I've had a lot of positive feedback about my first show with Kennedy expert Ed Cage. And today I have another expert for you, Dr. John McAdams.
Okay, I am here.
Okay, sounds good. Dr. McAdams earned his PhD in political science from Harvard, and he has been teaching at Marquette University since 1977. Like most everyone who was alive when President Kennedy was murdered, McAdams has a vivid memory of that day and how he heard the awful news.
Yeah, I was in typing class in high school, and a guy, he was a staffer at the high school, stuck his head in the door and said, "They've shot Kennedy." And then he said, "We're trying to get some news about it, but we can't," which sounded a bit sinister. Actually, it wasn't sinister at all because they were listening to a top 40 radio station. They were almost certainly listening to WVOK in Birmingham, Alabama. And like all top 40 radio stations, except for a very few with a big news operation, news at WVOK was what's called rip and read. That is, there was a news teleprinter, and the DJ, while the record was playing, would go over, tear off. If there was something important going on, like the assassination, tear off the latest dispatch and read it. And then there was no more news, so the DJ would have to play another record. And that was kind of aggravating. I remember one of my buddies, we all rushed out of the classroom, got in the cars in the front of the school and turned on the car radios so we could see what was happening. And my buddy was beating on the dashboard of the car. He wanted more news. But of course, the news, dribbled out. There were early reports, and then it was just sporadically stuff would come over the wire.
It wasn't until many decades later that McAdams took a dramatic interest in the case, thanks in large part to the Internet.
In the early 1990s, I had a student who told me about Usenet news groups. He didn't care about the JFK assassination. He hung out on whiny singles who can't get a date news groups. But I just sort of checked news groups and found alt.conspiracy.jfk and got drawn in, got interested in the topic. I'd been vaguely interested in the topic since the 1970s when I read a couple of articles and saw the CBS special hosted by Dan Rather in the middle 1970s. And so I just sort of got drawn in, and I wasn't inclined to believe in a conspiracy even to begin with, but when people started posting conspiracy stuff, I started thinking, well, I'll check it out. The Marquette Library had all 26 volumes. I checked out all 26 volumes and put them on the shelf beside my desk and started checking things out. And I found out that conspiracy claims, all of them that I could pretty much check out, turned out to be bogus. So I just sort of got drawn in. Then I started collecting materials, pictures, text files, etc., about the assassination, and started my website. I started it first on an ISP. Then in 1995, Windows 95 came out. It was robust enough that I could host a web server on my desktop machine, which I did. And so ever since I've been interested, ever since I've been collecting stuff, finding stuff, seeing stuff, eventually writing stuff and putting it online.
McAdams is currently the only administrator on the alt.assassination assassination.jfk newsgroup, which is still a very popular forum for many people interested in the case. He also continues to maintain his website, filled with reference material and factual information, jfkassassination.net. And he teaches a class at Marquette about the assassination.
And I'm curious what you typically find with the students who take your class. Like, why do they take your class? And do they end up changing their minds? Or, what's your experience with them?
They just want to know what happened. It's an iconic event. And it's kind of a sexy topic. So for a lot of students, it's sort of a dessert elective. That is to say, nobody has to take it to graduate, but they find themselves seniors, well, some juniors, but a lot of seniors, they can take a 3-hour elective, and they've heard about the class and want to know what happened. So they sign up for McAdams' JFK class. Probably the majority of students at the end of the class decide that Oswald did it all by himself, but not all. As I explain to them, at the end of the class, it's obvious to them that a lot of the stuff they read in conspiracy books is nonsense. But I explain to them that doesn't necessarily at all mean that there was no conspiracy. It could be that there really was a conspiracy and the conspirators lucked out when some crackpot witnesses, the names of a lot of the crackpot witnesses, some authors with crazy theories, irresponsible TV documentary makers, etc., all arrived on the scene and confused things so much that if there really is a conspiracy, the real evidence for it is buried under piles of nonsense. So even if they learn the lessons well, which is to say, a lot of so-called conspiracy evidence is bogus, that doesn't mean that there's no conspiracy. They don't have to agree with me on all the evidence by any means. For example, I think the evidence is there really was no grassy knoll shooter, but they might see the evidence differently. So while a majority of my students end up concluding there was no conspiracy, sizable minority, they believe there was.
A few years ago, McAdams took his many years of experience on this subject and channeled them into a book.
And what's the title of that again?
What's that?
What's the title of the book again?
JFK Assassination Logic, Evaluating Claims of Conspiracy. My wife insists that that's an absolutely terrible title, and she's probably right, because nobody particularly wants to hear about JFK assassination logic. They want interesting theories. And my book is more about how to eliminate theories and eliminate factoids and evaluate evidence than anything else.
I was curious about how he determined what material to use in his class.
Some conspiracy authors are dishonest. Some are quite honest. Mark Lane appears to be intentionally misleading people. He has a lawyerly way of avoiding saying things that are just flat out false, but which carefully mislead people. So I'm have a rather unfavorable opinion of Mark Lane. Tony Summers, on the other hand, I think is quite honest. His book, well, he's had different editions of the book over the years, but his book throws a lot of so-called conspiracy evidence at readers, but he doesn't overstate it. He's honest sometimes when something has been debunked, like in the 1990 edition of his book, he talks about the so-called acoustic evidence of the House Select Committee and admits, as he said, it's had a rough ride since then. So Summers is, in fact, quite honest. I have the students read Mark Lane's book, Jim Marrs' book, Crossfire. I've had some responsible conspiracy theorists chew me out about that because they know Jim Marrs will sort of buy anything under the sun. But the reason I have students read that is there's a lot of stuff in there that responsible conspiracy theorists know to be nonsense, but it is part of the mainstream, if you will, okay? Gene Hill, for example. Jim Marrs believes, or at least seemed to believe, Gene Hill. All right? Responsible conspiracy theorists know there are huge problems with her testimony, but she's in the movie JFK, right? So I'm faced with a situation where I don't want to give the students only the responsible conspiracy readings, because then there's a lot of stuff floating around that they might run into and they've never heard and don't know how to evaluate it. So I have them read Marrs' book, and I have them read the Warren Commission report, which is an astonishingly good read for a government document. It's actually a pretty decent read, which you would not expect of any government report or any government document.
Of course, most people don't read the Warren report, or even pick it up. They just watch the Oliver Stone film, JFK.
It's great cinema, it's terrible history. It's just that simple. I have my students watch it at the beginning of the course. I explain to them that, well, this is not a documentary, okay? So don't take everything in it as the literal truth, but I'm showing you this just to get you immersed into assassination lore, just so you know what people are saying and to get you immersed in one view of the evidence. And it's 3 hours long, and the students never complain about the length. It's that good as cinema. You can hold your attention very well for 3 hours. It's hard. It's hard history. Dave Reitzes has a web page where it's 100 or 101. I forget. I think it's 100 things that the movie JFK got wrong. Right. And he probably could add another 100 to it if he wanted to. I think he thought 100 was enough to make the point perfectly well. Right. But it's just completely terrible.
I had to ask McAdams the question that I often ask myself. Why does he keep doing this? What keeps him interested in the subject?
Well, there's always something new. There's always some new thing. When one thing gets debunked, something else comes up, or old stuff gets recycled and there's new evidence about the old stuff that's been recycled.
With all the stuff that you're maintaining online, I mean, are you seeing this as a public service that you're doing?
Well, yeah. If you mean alt.assassination.jfk, yeah, it's had its ups and downs. Some periods where a lot of real good new information has been out there, and other times when it seems to degenerate into kind of petty bickering. It's moderated, so we can hold down flame wars, but we pretty much let petty bickering go. I mean, you can't. We can't run it like a peer-reviewed academic journal where every post has to have real evidentiary value. We choose not to do that. Among all forums, JFK assassination forums and bulletin boards, it's the only one that I know of, maybe excepting Jeff Morley's blog and the very active comment section on Jeff Morley's blog, where nobody has been banned or tossed out. Because almost any JFK forum you can name, somebody has run afoul of the people running it and simply been banned. It's simply, well, you're causing trouble here. You can't post anymore. We're locking you out. And some, like Greg Burnham's forum, they basically say no one's allowed to say that Oswald did it all alone. It's all conspiracy and nothing but conspiracy. So alt.assassination.jfk is the place where you can be pro or anti-conspiracy. You can post crazy theories. You can post mainstream stuff. You can, I'm afraid, even engage in petty bickering, and you won't get banned. If you sort of step out of line and actually insult somebody, your post will get rejected. But that's sort of where we're positioned.
I am curious, what do you hear the most often? What are the most commonly repeated lies or problems or misunderstandings?
Oh my, that's difficult to say. There's so many. A whole set that particularly appall me, which I've referred to, is the alterationists. People who think the Zapruder film has been altered, that the autopsy photos and x-rays have been altered or faked or forged, and the backyard photos have been altered and faked and forged. And it just gets bizarre sometimes. It's for the autopsy photos and x-rays and the backyard photos. I think the House Select Committee in the 1970s laid that to rest entirely. It's a stunningly thorough and professional job by real scientists of authenticating those. It's if I could get upset about anything regarding this case, which I can't because you eventually have to be kind of blasé about it, it would be the alterationists, the people who will, at the drop of a hat, claim that any inconvenient piece of evidence was altered or faked or forged.
Why is it, despite all the facts, that so many people continue to accept the idea that Oswald didn't act alone?
Well, for the most part, they've heard this or that conspiracy claim, and they've never looked into it in detail and never heard the debunking. They saw the movie JFK, or they get the vague idea. Somebody told them that the single bullet theory doesn't make any sense. Even seeing it parodied on Seinfeld. And they know just a little bit, and the little bit they know is conspiracy, so they adopt a conspiracy theory. It's also the case that believing in a conspiracy is a dandy way to demonize whomever you don't like in American society. For the lefties, and the conspiracy culture clearly leans left, it could be the military-industrial complex or Texas oil millionaires. The John Birch Society has always made a point of claiming that communism killed Kennedy, and they seem to want to believe that Oswald was a Russian agent of some kind. Of course, if you don't like Castro, you can blame Castro. And since nobody much likes people think they don't like the mafia. They seem to love Tony Soprano, but they think they don't like the mafia. So, hey, why not blame the mafia? And a nice, neat conspiracy theory can be much handier than the really messy historical reality that I think clearly points to Oswald. But, there's the normal amount of messiness. There is, he went to the Cuban embassy, in the Soviet embassy in Mexico City. There must be something there. Well, I think all that is there was a guy who was desperate to get into Cuba, but you can think, whoa, there must be something there. So Oswald was enough of an oddball whose path crossed all kinds of possibly sinister situations that it's sort of, you can always wonder, well, maybe there's something there, maybe there's not.
So for the average person who won't have the opportunity to take your class, what is the best resource for them to just kind of want to get a handle on what happened?
Well, start by reading my book, JFK Assassination Logic. Okay. Well, that's okay. That's self-serving. Um, what is the best? First of all, what's the best lone assassin book, which I think is the one that will be accurate? It's still probably Gerald Posner's book from the early 1990s, Case Closed. I think it could do a better job of dealing with the scientific evidence, for example, from the autopsy, etc. But it's a good book because it does give a coherent account of what happened. So that would be a good one to read. As for a conspiracy book, if you want sort of everything conspiratorial with no critical judgment applied, well, again, Jim Marr's book. If you want a conspiracy book that isn't too far out there, and as I said before, is intellectually honest, Tony Summers' book, which I think is now titled Not in Your Lifetime. And the truth is, the Warren Commission report is amazingly readable for a government document, and it's actually a great place to start. See what the Warren Commission said. The truth is, I think an objective reader will be impressed with how scrupulous they are in dealing with evidence and how thorough they are. Now, did they deal with the autopsy evidence well? No. You have to read something else for that. Could they deal with conspiracy arguments and conspiracy witnesses that came forward years later? No, they couldn't deal with that. But the Warren Commission report's well worth reading.
Have you ever read Earl Warren's memoir?
No, I have not.
He has an interesting account in there of, because he didn't talk to the press, about the Warren report, but he was someplace in South America one time, and the press asked if they could ask him some questions about it, and he said, sure, let's talk about it. And he said that he was just amazed that all the way down in South America, he was getting all these questions that were not real questions, that things that had already been answered, things that he had heard over and over again and had already been debunked by the Warren Commission. And it was so clear that they had all these conspiratorial ideas, but they didn't really have the facts.
Yeah, well, Mark Lane, after all, toured Europe, spreading conspiracy stories around there. And sometimes Europeans seem particularly prone to conspiracy theories, maybe because they have a long history and have had a lot of conspiracies at various times. I don't know. Or maybe it's kind of latent anti-Americanism. I'm not sure. But you're right. It's been an iconic historical event. That's a worldwide iconic historical event. John Kennedy, if you look at his presidency in a really stone-cold sober way, was not a great president. His legislative accomplishments were, well, close to non-existent. Some has touted initiatives like the initiative toward Latin America, they didn't really amount to much. The Peace Corps, great press, but the truth is a bunch of idealistic young American recent college graduates going to various other countries isn't going to change very much. So if you look at it in a stone-cold sober way, he was not a great president. But in terms of glamour, in terms of publicity, not just in the U.S., but in Latin America. Again, the Alliance for Peace was I think it was Alliance for Peace in Latin America was his initiative. And in Europe, he was a rock star, very, very different from Eisenhower. Americans liked Ike, but by 1960, they were looking for a little more glamour in the presidency. So the hype and the charisma exceeded the objective performance. But of course, given the hype and given the charisma, the assassination really resonated. And that's why it became a really epic-making historical event.
The murder of President Kennedy was an enormous tragedy, but not in the way conspiracy theorists imagine. He wasn't going to end the Vietnam War and the Cold War, dismantle the CIA, remove discrimination from society, and destroy the mafia in his second term. In fact, he may not have even been elected to a second term. I think the general public has an unrealistic idea of presidential power and an extremely inflated impression of President Kennedy's greatness. I wish there were more teachers like Dr. John McAdams out there to counter the Oliver Stones and Mark Lanes of the world. And speaking with him encouraged me to continue on with my own efforts to combat historical nonsense. I hope you'll join me next time when I have a third Kennedy assassination expert on as my guest, David Reitz. If you are looking for something to do in the meantime, check out my new documentary, Conspiracy Theorists Lie, at nomagicbullets.org.
Thank you for listening to This Must Be the Podcast. Our host is James K. Lambert. Our music was composed by Steve Yeager, and I'm the announcer, Keith Kopatz. This Must Be the Podcast is a jamesklambert.com production.
So is there anything I've missed that you think really should be addressed?
There are a million little pieces of evidence here or there we could discuss, but that would probably get tedious and is way beyond your purpose in this interview. So I can't think of anything else at the moment.
All right. Well, I appreciate your time. Thank you very much for talking to me.
Thank you. I enjoyed talking to you.